Hey, Lika Hevra, my holy friends. How are you? That was Toy Amecha by Joey Newcomb from his album, How Are You, Reb Yid. And we had a freezing even during the countdown. Please God, may that be the last time the stream freezes during our class. Today we're opening a new Masechet, a new tractate of the Talmud. This is the 11th volume of the Talmud, Tractate Megillah, the laws of Purim. And because we read the Megillah on Purim, we'll also be talking about the laws of other public readings of the Torah and Scripture. And a lot of beautiful Agadata stories and interpretations of passages from the book of Esther and elsewhere. It's a very colorful volume. I'm sure you're going to love it. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we enter Tractate Megillah? Come on. You're not frozen. You're not frozen. Stay unfrozen. Facebook. Facebook is worse. Definitely Facebook is worse than YouTube. Okay. Over on YouTube, we got Neil and Lynn in North Texas. On Facebook, we got Yehudit in South Carolina, Bill in Missouri, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, Gwen in Michigan, James in Indianapolis, Hannah in New York, Nancy in North Carolina, Stephen in Maine, John in Maine, Tom in PA, Caroline in Raleigh, Lucy in Minnesota, Paula knee tapping in the Great Northwest, Christo in Lubbock, Sharon in Lebanon, Bella in Venice, Paula, thank you for letting me know I was interrupted, Pauline in Arkansas, Paula in Chicago, Greg and Paula married 53 years today. And may you enjoy another 53 years at least in this world and eternity together. Happy anniversary. You two were made for each other. It's so great. And it'll be there. And we're all frustrated. I just don't know. I just don't know. Look, we're going to get through, with God's help, our annual campaign, and then we're going to be building the app, and we're also going to just, bring in some kind of streaming company to see if we could do better. I just don't know what it is. We pay for the most robust internet. It's, 1,000 megabits per second is our capacity here. There's no lack of bandwidth from our internet. I just don't know what is causing these glitches, but with God's help, we'll get it worked out. All right. Yeah, so just when it freezes, just reload. Be patient. When I see it freeze on my monitor here, I pause speaking, so you won't miss anything. I'm really sorry. Okay. Everyone's giving a mazel tov to Paula. Beautiful. Charles is reminding me, breathing deeply. Breathing deeply in Omaha. Exactly. Miriam in Hayden, Colorado. Celsa in Texas. Rachel in Denver. And Nancy says it still reads live video interrupted. Nancy, try to reload, and if not, go to YouTube. Accidental Talmudist on YouTube. It seems to be a little bit better on YouTube. All right, my friends. Today's episode, our first in Tractate Megillah, the very beautiful and colorful Tractate Megillah, is sponsored by our dear friend AJ Stern. And AJ says, in honor of Sal, thank you, AJ. May you and Yael and the whole family be showered in blessings, even more than your ample imagination could conceive. And we all say amen. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. If you want to join AJ and all the people who have sponsored episodes, do it now during our annual campaign. It's fantastic. All donations are doubled at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. And help us build the app and just get away from reliance. We'll always keep streaming on Facebook and YouTube. We just don't want to be relying on that as our only channel when we can have a direct conduit into the app that with your help and with God's help and yours, we will be building. All right, Tractate Megillah. I also want to give a shout out to somebody who's going to be a guest on our podcast in the not too distant future, Rabbi Daniel Friedman. He's got this series of books called The Transformative Daf. Our friends at Mosaic Press sent this to me. And I just read it. It's beautiful. I mean, he's got a commentary on, I don't know if he's done all of the tractates of the Talmud. They sent me Rosh Hashanah and Megillah. But he's got a beautiful commentary on each page of the daf, really making it personal. His whole idea is transformative Judaism, transformative Talmud study. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It should get into us and help us become that man or woman that we were meant to be. And how can these teachings help us do that? Really beautiful idea that we'll get to in a moment based on this opening daf of Tractate Megillah. So, the Mishna, the first Mishna of chapter 1 here on page 2. All tractates begin on page 2. The Megillah is read on the 11th, on the 12th, on the 13th, on the 14th, or on the 15th of the month of Adar, the Hebrew month of Adar, the springtime month of Adar, which contains Purim. This is the month before Nisan, the month that contains Passover. Cities that have been surrounded by a wall since the days of Joshua, the son of Nun, Joshua who led the children of Israel out of the desert and into the promised land, taking over for Moses, who was not allowed to enter. So cities that were walled at that time and continue to exist, Jews who live in such cities have different requirements for celebrating Purim than Jews who live in any other kind of city. Cities that have been surrounded by a wall, right? So a walled city implies a large city, a protected city. Cities that have been surrounded by a wall since the days of Joshua, the son of Nun, read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar, whereas villages and large towns that have not been walled since the days of Joshua, the son of Nun, read it on the 14th, and we'll discuss why. However, the sages instituted that the villages, right, the small towns, the villages may advance their reading to the day of assembly. What was the day of assembly in these villages? Remember, this is an ancient agrarian society. We still have this a little bit when we think about farmers markets, right? You go to the farmers market, they're only on certain days of the week. So the shopping days were the days of assembly, Mondays and Thursday. And that's why still to this day, in our morning services, we have a Torah reading. Of course, we have it on Shabbos, but we also have a short Torah reading on Mondays and Thursdays, because those were the days when you could get the people into town. The farmers from the far-flung fields would come in to bring what to sell to the villagers. The villagers would come to the marketplace to buy what the farmers were selling. And while everyone was gathered, you could get together for a short service and have a short Torah reading. So it made sense that when we're talking about one of the primary requirements of Purim, the story recounted in the book of Esther, is that you read the book of Esther. And the book of Esther is referred to as the Megillah. It's one of the Megillahs. There's 5 Megillahs. This is the most famous, certainly. And we read the Megillas Esther, the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, on Purim publicly. And the mitzvah of Purim, in terms of the Megillah, is not to read it, it's to hear it, right? The actual commandment is to hear it. Everybody is commanded to hear the Megillah being read and to be attentive when you're hearing it. So it makes sense that since the mitzvah is to hear it being read, that you want the people already assembled, and so they would do that on Mondays and Thursdays. And what we're learning here in our Mishnah is that if Purim doesn't fall on a Monday or a Thursday, and it can't absolutely fall on one or the other because it's celebrated in walled cities that were walled even at the time of Joshua, on the 15th, everywhere else celebrated on the 14th. So if neither of those days lands on a Monday or Thursday, they're going to make adjustments so that people can hear it read, at least in the villages, they can hear it read on a Monday or a Thursday. How so? If the 14th of Adar which is when we normally celebrate Purim. It's the 15th in the walled cities. But on the 14th of Adar, if it occurs on a Monday, the villages and the large towns read it on that day. That's a day of assembly. And the walled cities read it on the next day, since they don't have this assembly issue. They're already a large city. There's plenty of people available to gather. So they read it on the 15th. And that's the way it's supposed to be done, 14th and 15th. If the 14th occurs on a Tuesday or Wednesday, so now the villages are going to advance their reading to the day of assembly, i.e. to Monday the 12th or the 13th of Adar. Now the large towns are going to read it on that day, on the 14th of Adar when it's supposed to happen, and the walled cities read it on the next day, on the 15th, as instructed from days of old. If the 14th occurs on Thursday, okay, so the villages and large towns read it on the 14th, and the walled cities read it the next day on the 15th, as they're supposed to. If the 14th occurs on a Friday, Erev Shabbos, so the villages advance their readings to the day of assembly, to Thursday, the 13th of Adar, and the large towns and the walled cities read it on that day, on the 14th, because we do not do a Megillah reading on Shabbos. If the 14th occurs on Shabbos, okay, so the villages and the large towns are going to advance their reading to Thursday, the day of assembly, which is the 12th of Adar, and the walled cities are going to read it on the day after Purim, which is the 15th, in this case, Sunday. If the 14th occurs on Sunday, the villages advance their reading to the day of assembly, which is Thursday, so that's the earliest it can be in the month of Adar. Now it's the 11th of Adar. And the large towns read it on that day, on the 14th of Adar, which is Sunday, and the walled cities read it on the next day, which is the 15th. Now, what Dan Friedman, Rabbi Daniel Friedman, points out in this book, The Transformative Daf, when he's talking about, is it merely as a convenience to make sure that people are able to assemble, that they made these kind of policy changes? And as we'll see, they didn't last. We don't do this today, right? Today, Purim is always observed on the 14th of Adar, unless it should somehow land on Shabbos, which I don't know if they've arranged the calendar so it can't. But it's just done on the 14th, except in cities which were walled, 3,000 years ago, at the time of Joshua leading the people into the promised land. Which city is like that? Jerusalem, right? So in Jerusalem, they're going to read the Megillah on the 15th. Everywhere else, it's going to be, I'm pretty sure it's like, it is, Jerusalem is on the 15th, which is called Shushan Purim. So is it just a convenience? Is it just a policy matter? Says Rabbi Friedman, very interesting, what is the big deal? It's going to be explained momentarily that the problem is, and why they kind of ended this, is because if they're moving Purim up, the reading of the Megillah up before Purim, and some people come in and hear the Megillah being read, so they might assume that actually is Purim, right? Even though it's being read on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th ahead, it's been advanced so that it would be on a day of assembly on a Thursday or on a Monday. So people could become confused and think that is Purim. And then if you count 30 days from Purim, it's Passover. And so since now Purim came in 2 or 3 days early, these people might then count based on what they experienced when they came into town, and then they start Passover early. That's not the worst thing if you start Passover early, but what's very bad is if you finish Passover early, because during the week of Passover, it's a major transgression for a Jew to eat chametz, right? To eat bread products that we can't eat during the week of Passover. So he's going to think that Passover's over before it really is, and then he's eating chametz, right? Now, what Daniel Friedman is saying, spiritually speaking, that's the sort of practical matters. But spiritually speaking, the people in the cities, they look at the Purim story in which God's hand is quite hidden. And they say, well, really what Purim is all about is beautiful, like outstanding, well-executed advocacy by Esther getting the ear of the king, guided by the diplomatic, counsel of her uncle Mordecai, and saving the Jewish people by getting the ear of the king and seizing the communication machinery of the Persian kingdom, the biggest kingdom the world had ever known, the empire. Because God's hand is hidden, right? And city people are going to be quick to kind of go to that understanding of the holiday and not really think about God's hidden hand in all those events. Whereas country people are much less prone to do that. Why? Because in an ancient agrarian society, where if the rain is late, the crops don't grow. If an infestation gets into the field, the crops could be devastated. If after you harvest, rodents, get into the silos and have some kind of a rodent infestation, whereas a few days ago you had all the wealth of all that work of the whole summer and the fall season, and now you've got the silo towering with all that grain that's going to provide for you and your family, and then overnight it could be ruined. Right? And so they know when the farmer is just naturally a more spiritual person because he knows that we rely so much on the goodwill of God to enjoy the fruits of our labors, even if we work hard, right? It could all be taken away from us at any moment. And so country people, they're just more in tune with the seasons, with the cycles of life, with life and death itself, slaughtering animals on the farm. They know that dinner is not just a cube of meat in a styrofoam box. They tended to the animal, they slaughtered the animal, they butchered the animal. Much more in tune with God are the country people. And so bringing the country people to the city people, as it were, on those market days was something that it was very beneficial to the city people. And the lesson we have to learn is to sort of, not allow that Purim consciousness, in this case, the idea of Purim consciousness being that we think we're running things because God's hand is hidden and we start to just believe in our own power to the nth degree. Rather, the Passover mentality, when we were fully reliant on the Lord, God brought us the plagues. God, with a mighty hand, brought us out of Egypt. God fed us in the desert, right? And so the country folk have more that Passover mentality. The city folk have more that Purim mentality. And we really need to always be, turning our consciousness into, country people, right? In the sense that everything that I have is a gift from God. Everything could be taken away from me, and I'm grateful for every day, right? And if we're not going to have that kind of mingling with country folk that we had in ancient times, then it's up to us to have that consciousness in our lives. Okay. So we did that. Okay, so if the 14th occurs on Shabbos, both the villages and the large towns advance the reading to the day of assembly, i.e. Thursday the 12th of Adar, and the walled cities read it on the day after Purim, which is the 15th. If the 14th occurs on Sunday, the villages advance their reading to the day of assembly, which is Thursday, the 11th of Adar, and the large towns read it on that day, on the 14th of Adar, and the walled cities read it on the next day, the 15th. That's the Mishna. Now the Gemara. We learned in the Mishnah, the Megillah is read on the 11th of Adar, right? And occasionally when the 14th lands on Sunday, so in those times, in the villages, they would read the Megillah on the 11th. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? And the Gemara expresses surprise at the question. What room is there to ask from where do we derive the halacha? The reason is, as we intend to say further on, the sages were lenient with the villages and allowed them to advance their reading of the Megillah to the day of assembly so that they would be free to supply water and food to their brethren in the cities, right? A market day when the people from the countryside could bring in what the city people needed. Not just food and water, as Daniel Friedman says, also that spirituality and that perspective they brought into the market days. And the Gemara explains, and this is what we said, i.e., this is what we meant when we asked the question. Now, all of these days when the Megillah may be read were enacted by the members of the Great Assembly when they established the holiday of Purim itself. Who were the great assembly? When we read Pirkei Avos, we read about the chain of transmission of the Torah. God gave it to Moses. Moses gave it to Joshua. Joshua gave it to the elders. The elders gave it to the prophets. And the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. So the great assembly was active in the early Second Temple period alongside the final prophets, Malachi, Zechariah, I think Hosea, right? Ezra at that time, right? So these were the men of the great assembly, and they kind of like figured out a bunch of stuff that we still do. So one of the things that they said, now the Purim story took place away from the land of Israel, right? It took place in Shushan, the capital of the Persian Empire. The Persians had battled the Babylonians and beat them. That's why the Babylonian Talmud was created in Babylonia, the Babylonian Jewish community, but under the auspices of the Persian Empire. Okay, well, when they established that owing to the events of the story in the book of Esther, that this would be a holiday. Now, who established that? It says in the book of Esther that Mordecai and Esther did it, right? Esther was the queen of that whole empire, and Mordecai was very closely related to her and became the advisor to the king, Ahasuerus, but he was one of the men of the great assembly. And, you know, they didn't just write down the events and then say we're going to read it out loud. They established all the rules of what Purim would be. Over time, additional rules were necessary so we could follow the rules as times and technologies, etc., changed. But they established the rules. And what they said was that they would, observe Purim on the 14th, except for people in the cities that were walled since the time of Joshua, which was similar to the city of Shushan, where the events of Purim lasted one more day. And that's why they celebrate Purim on the 15th. So how can you come along and say, sages of the late Second Temple period and post-Temple period, that you can observe Purim by reading the Megillah on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th of Adar? How can you overrule the men of the Great Assembly? That's what's being asked now. As if it enters your mind to say that the members of the Great Assembly enacted only the 14th and 15th as days for reading the Megillah, is it possible that the later sages came and uprooted an ordinance that was enacted by the members of the Great Assembly? Didn't we learn in a Mishna and Eduyot that a rabbinical court cannot rescind the statements of another rabbinical court unless it is superior to it in wisdom and in number? No subsequent court was ever greater than the members of the Great Assembly, so it would be impossible for another court to rescind the enactments of the members of the Great Assembly. They weren't just a Sanhedrin, right? They had prophets among them, and they were the sort of largest and most authoritative court in Jewish history. I mean, you could say that they weren't as authoritative as Moses and, earlier prophets, but as a body, as a governing body, certainly there's never been anything more powerful since. So how could we overrule a ruling of the Great Assembly? Rather, it is obvious that all these days, that this idea that they could read on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th, all these days were actually enacted by the members of the Great Assembly themselves. And the question is, where did they get the authority to do that from Scripture? Where do we find an allusion to this in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible? The Megillah itself, the book of Esther, which was approved by the members of the Great Assembly, mentions only the 14th and 15th of the month of Adar. So there must be an allusion in there that allowed the men of the Great Assembly to say that the Megillah could be read on the 11th, 12th, or 13th. So Rav Shemin bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said it is alluded to in the verse that states, Esther 9:31, to confirm these days of Purim in their times. And the phrase in their times indicates that they enacted many times and not only 2 days. Immediately the Gemara objects. This verse is necessary for its own purpose, to teach that the days of Purim must be observed at the proper times. That's what it means. In their times just means at the proper times. And the Gemara responds, well, if so, let the verse say to confirm these days of Purim in its time. Singular, its singular time. What is the significance of the term their times? Their plural, times plural, right? It belongs to something plural, and the times themselves are plural. It indicates that many times were established for the reading of the Megillah. The Gemara objects, but still the plural term is necessary to indicate that the time of this walled city, which is celebrated on the 15th, is not the same as the time of that unwalled town, i.e., Purim is celebrated on different days in different places. On the 15th in the walled cities, walled since the times of Joshua, and on the 14th everywhere else. That must be what the Megillah means when it says in their times. The Gemara answers, if so, let the verse say in their time. Right? Indicating that each place celebrates Purim on its respective day. What is the significance of the compound plural? Okay. That it is possible to enumerate on all these days in our Mishnah. The Gemara asks, if so, say that the plural term indicates many times, and the Megillah may be read even earlier than the 11th of Adar. And the Gemara rejects that argument. The compound plural, their times, should be understood as similar to the simple plural term, their time. Just as the term their time can be understood to refer to 2 days, indicating that each location reads the Megillah in its respective time on the 14th or the 15th, so too, their times should be understood as referring to only 2 additional days when the Megillah may be read. And the Gemara says, okay, well, if you're saying that there's just 2 added days when it's possible to read the Megillah, and it's not the 14th or 15th, so that must mean the 12th and the 13th of Adar. How then is it derived that you could read the Megillah on the 11th of Adar, when you bring it all the way up from a Sunday the 14th to a Thursday on the 11th? How is that permissible? And the Gemara answers, this is as Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said in a different context. The 13th of Adar is a time of assembly for all, as it was on that day that the Jews assembled to fight their enemies. And the main miracle was performed on that day. On the 13th of Adar was a big day in the story of Esther. All. Okay. What I'm seeing is it freezes sometimes for no reason. When it freezes, it resumes shortly thereafter. And so I take a deep breath and move on. Okay. Maybe red. So since the 13th is part of the holiday, we don't need a special allusion for that in Scripture, and therefore the extra times are the 11th and the 12th, and that's why we could read it on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, or the 15th. And the Gemara objects, yeah, but what's to say that the 2 days can only be added on the early side? Perhaps these extra times that we can read out from in their times, you could read the Megillah on the 16th of Adar or on the 17th of Adar. And the Gemara responds, it is written, Esther 9:27, and it shall not pass, indicating that the celebration of Purim is not delayed into a later date. We might read it early, we cannot read it late. Now I skip a few paragraphs. With regard to the Mishnah's ruling that the Megillah may be read on the day of assembly, Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan Akiva, the unattributed. Rabbi Akiva, the unattributed, what does that mean? That's a strange title for a person to say, to have, Rabbi Akiva, the unattributed. And what they mean by that is that many Mishnahs, which are written, anonymously without attribution, are actually the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and perhaps that applies here. Most unattributed statements of Tanaim were formulated by Rabbi Akiva's students, as he derives laws based on the distinction that he draws from between the terms time, their time, and their times. That's how we read out extra days. However, the sages say one may read the Megillah only in its designated time, i.e. on the 14th of Adar. Right? So some sages disagree with this opinion and say, no, forget this advancing the Megillah for the villages and the day of the assembly and reading it on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th. No, you can only read it on the 14th. Now that actually is the law today. You only read it on the 14th, except in the very few Jewish communities around the world that are located in ancient cities that had a wall around them, even at the time that Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. Everywhere else, the Megillah is read on the 14th of Adar. And no, none of this advancing stuff. So the Gemara raises an following Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda said, when is one permitted to read the Megillah from the 11th to the 15th of Adar? One may read on these dates at a time when the years are established properly and the Jewish people dwell securely in their land, meaning the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem is saying when the new month begins, right? And then we have that little bit of flexibility in the calendar for the decrees of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem saying this new month has begun, for that word of that to get out to the far reaches of the Jewish community in the diaspora, as we've discussed many times. That's why we still have 2-day Rosh Hashanah everywhere, and 2-day Pesach, first days of Pesach, and 2 days of Shavuos, and 2 days at the beginning of Sukkot, and 2 days at the end, because when the Sanhedrin was dwelling securely. But this idea that you could advance the Megillah reading is only when the Sanhedrin is determining the calendar from Jerusalem. Otherwise, it's on the 14th, period, end of story. So now, however, nowadays, and this is Talmud talking nowadays, at least 1,500 years ago, but saying, however, nowadays, since people look to the reading of the Megillah and use it to calculate when Passover begins, one may read the Megillah only in its designated time so as not to cause confusion with regard to the date of Passover, which is exactly 1 month from the day after Purim. Now, you would think that if they know when the 14th of Adar is, they would also know when the 11th of Adar is and when the 14th and 15th of Nisan are, but that's the way it's written. And the Gemara analyzes this Baraisa, in accordance with whose opinion did Rabbi Yehuda issue his ruling, saying that, and that is the ruling that we follow now, that the Megillah is only read on the 14th. But in accordance with whose opinion did Rabbi Yehuda give this ruling? If we say that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, whose opinion is expressed in the Mishna, well, there's a difficulty, as Rabbi Akiva holds, that even nowadays this ordinance applies. According to Rabbi Akiva, it is permitted for the residents of villages to read the Megillah early, like on a Thursday when they are all gathered. Rabbi Akiva would allow that even in the days after the in accordance with the opinion of the sages who disagreed with Rabbi Akiva. And nevertheless, at least when the years are established properly and the Jewish people dwell securely in their land, the Megillah is read even prior to the 14th, as the sages disagree only about the law nowadays. And this contradicts the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that the Megillah could never be read earlier than the 14th of Adar. And the Gemara concludes, the refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan is indeed a conclusive refutation. Skip a couple paragraphs. The Gemara adds, Rav Ashi poses a difficulty. Rav Ashi is one of the editors of the Gemara. Rav Ashi poses a difficulty based on an apparent contradiction between the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in this Baraisa we just mentioned and a ruling cited in a Mishna in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. And he establishes the Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei bar Yehuda rather than Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara explains this apparent contradiction. Did Rabbi Yehuda actually say that nowadays, since people look to the reading of the Megillah on the 14th and use it to calculate when Passover will begin 1 month later, that therefore one may read the Megillah only at its designated time on the 14th of Adar? Did Rabbi Yehuda actually say that? The Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishnah that we're going to come to on page 5. Rabbi Yehuda said, when is one permitted to read the Megillah as early as the 11th of Adar? In a place where the villagers generally enter town on Monday and Thursday. However, in a place where they do not generally enter town on Monday and Thursday, one may read the Megillah only at its designated time on the 14th. Now, this Mishnah indicates that at least in a place where the villagers enter town on Monday and Thursday, one may read the Megillah on the 11th of Adar, even nowadays. Nowadays, according to this Talmudic time, when when the sages are teaching themselves, But long after the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin was disbanded, and the calendar was already fixed for all time. So it would seem like, wait a minute, at least in some places, they could advance the reading of the Megillah to the 11th. And due to this contradiction, Rav Ashi establishes the Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of someone else, not Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yosei bar Yehuda. And the Gemara expresses surprise. Wait a minute. Because Rav Ashi poses a difficulty due to the apparent contradiction between the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in a Baraisa and the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in a Mishna, he establishes a Baraisa that was thought to be in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, no, it wasn't in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. Actually, it was in the name of Rabbi Yosei bar Yehuda. How can he take such liberty with the tradition? Yes, sometimes the oral traditions could get a little bit, contradictory with other parts of the oral tradition, but you can't just say, well, because we encountered a contradiction, we're just going to change it. Right? Where does he get this idea to attribute it to Rabbi Yosei bar Yehuda? And the Gemara explains, Rav Ashi heard that there were those who taught the Baraisa in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, and there were others who taught it in the name of Rabbi Yosei bar Yehuda. And since he had a difficulty with this apparent contradiction between one ruling of Rabbi Yehuda and another ruling of Rabbi Yehuda, he said, okay, so the one who taught it in the name of Rabbi Yehuda is not precise, whereas the one who taught it in the name. But I'm really getting frustrated with all the stream freezing. So I'm just going to do a few more paragraphs and then go to questions and comments. We learned in the Mishnah, cities that have been surrounded by a wall since the days of Joshua, the son of Nun, read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? As they are not stated explicitly in the Megillah. We've been taking this as a given all along tonight, that on the 5th, they read it on the 15th in these ancient walled cities and the 14th everywhere else. Well, how do we know that? It is, as the verse states, Esther 9:19, therefore the Jews of the villages who dwell in the unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and feasting. That's Purim. And from the fact that the unwalled towns celebrate Purim on the 14th, it may be derived that the walled cities celebrate Purim on the 15th. And the Gemara challenged unwalled towns celebrate Purim on the 14th, as indicated in the verse. And the walled cities do not celebrate it at all. And the Gemara expresses astonishment. And are they not Jews? And furthermore, it is written that the kingdom of Ahasuerus was from Hodu until Cush, and the celebration of Purim was accepted in all the countries of his kingdom. It was the greatest empire the world had ever known. So every Jew in the world lived somewhere within the Persian Empire, and they all celebrated Purim, no matter what kind of town they lived in. So if in the walled cities, in the unwalled towns, they celebrate on the 14th, it must mean that somebody else celebrated on a different day, not that they didn't celebrate it at all. And what was that other day? The 15th. That's the only day that's left, because that's an important day in the story too. Rather, the following challenge may be raised. Say that the unwalled towns celebrate Purim on the 14th and the walled cities celebrate it on the 14th and on the 15th. As it is written, they should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same in every year. Esther 9:21. So this verse can be understood to mean that there are places where Purim is celebrated on both days. So in the unwalled towns, it's on the 14th. And in the ancient walled cities, it's a 2-day holiday. And they celebrate on the 14th and the 15th. And the Gemara says, no. If it had been written in the verse, the 14th day, the 15th, and the 15th, it would be as you originally said. However, now that it is written, the 14th day and the S, the 15th day, and this Hebrew construction with the S or et, it's a word without a translation into English, but it's a grammatical structure that changes the meaning slightly. The particle et used here to denote the accusative comes and interrupts, indicating that the 2 days are distinct. Therefore, the residents of these locations celebrate Purim on the 14th, and the residents of those locations celebrate it on the 15th. And the Gemara suggests, say that the residents of the unwalled towns celebrate Purim on the 14th, as stated in the verse. And with regard to the residents of the walled cities, if they wish, they may celebrate it on the 14th. And if they wish, they may celebrate it on the 15th. And the Gemara responds, the verse states, in their times, indicating that the time when the residents of this place celebrate Purim is not the time when the residents of that place celebrate Purim. And that's where we're going to leave off tonight. I'm going to go to your questions and comments, and I hope I won't have another freeze. Okay. Whew. Sorry if I was short-tempered. I did manage to eat dinner and break the fast, but it was quite a day today. Quite a day. All right, Yosef. Just wanted to ask a practical question since we just started this new tractate. With all our busy lives, including our spiritual practices, daily prayers, etc., what is the best way to make sure we can get the main idea in studying our daf with everything else we may be studying, like Torah portions and such? It can feel like juggling sometimes, but still I'm very motivated and delighted. I mean, yeah, like, you know, I don't know how to answer your question. Like you basically, you can't learn everything. And the more learning you do, the better. And we all are real people in the real world, living real lives, and stuff happens and stuff comes up. So, you know, my first journey through the daf, I just made sure to read my daf every day. And there were some days when I missed it. You know, stuff came up and I just couldn't read the daf that day. And so then the next day I would read 2. Sometimes things really got crazy and I would miss 2 or 3 days or 4 days. In fact, I was in film, I was, shooting When Do We Eat during that period. And so at one point I got a month behind. And then finally, when my schedule evened out, I just did 2 a day or 3 a day until I caught up, right? But, to do Daf Yomi, you really have to read every page. And, because of the limitations of our class and what we're doing here, what I'm trying to go a little bit deeper, I don't necessarily read every paragraph of the page. I try to when possible. It's a short page, but like today, we didn't do all the material on Daf Base, on page 2 here of Tractate Megillah. So I know it's taking on a lot, that if you want to really say you did Daf Yomi, like make sure, if you're following along, then you'll know what we skipped, and then you could just make that up right after class. Or if you're doing it on your own, of course, just read it all the way through. Now, what comes up is some pages are more inspiring than others, right? Some pages, like here, there's a lot of really interesting material. When we get to page 7, such colorful stories. And it's just kind of easier to be emotionally involved. When we get to Tractate Yevamos, which is all the laws of levirate marriage and, which relationships are possible and which aren't, it gets super technical. And then, and when we were in Tractate Eruvin, sometimes it was very technical and difficult. At that time, when I was making my first journey through Daf Yomi, I would say to myself, wow, it's amazing the passion of our sages to figure out God's will in every variation of a possibility of a situation. How would God want us to behave? And being that meticulous, it's one of those things. It's sort of like, you remember the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off, right? Wax on, wax off. It was like, because he did all those repetitions, then there was the moment where he could defend himself. There was a moment where he could make the perfect strike. So because we put in the hours, then there's going to be moments possible when we have that flash of insight that's so emotional and beautiful and moving, but that we wouldn't have had if we didn't put in the time. That's the best I can say. Tom, what is the difference between the Great Assembly and the Sanhedrin? Right, so the Great Assembly was an earlier body. It performed the same functions of the Sanhedrin, but it was earlier in time. That's the main thing, right? It was earlier in time, it was a larger group. At the beginnings of the Great Assembly, it included prophets, right? So, once prophecy ended at the beginning of the Second Temple period, it never came back. So when there were prophets among us, we had a much more open channel to discerning God's will, because God would tell the prophet exactly what God wanted, and the prophet would tell us. So they had a higher authority that way. Also, they were earlier in history. They were closer to the revelation at Mount Sinai than we are. And so, less was lost between Sinai and the Great Assembly than between Sinai and us. Another reason they have greater authority. In terms of how many people served in the Great Assembly, what kinds of cases came before them, it was also a long time ago and somewhat shrouded, by the mists of time, as it were. But the point is, earlier and more authoritative. Jeremy, over from the YouTube side, is the Messiah going to correct all those opinions? I think what you're asking is, contradictions. And sort of going way back, right, there was the big discrepancies and conflicts between the followers of Hillel and of Shammai. And generally speaking, the law follows Hillel, base Hillel. But when the Messiah comes, generally speaking, the law is going to follow Shammai, who were more stringent, right? And it's because in the absence of the certainty of what God wants from us, the sages try to be lenient when they can be. It's harder to say yes than to say no, but they try to be lenient. And that's why we follow the opinions of Hillel. But once knowledge of God fills the world like water fills the sea, then we're going to know exactly what it is that God wants from us. Maybe new questions will come up. There's certainly going to be ample room for amazing new Torah insights once the Messiah comes. But we will get answers, right, from the Messiah or even from God himself. And so a lot of these apparent open questions, the Talmud will often encounter a question that was left taiku, unresolved, let it stand. Those kinds of questions, yes, they will be answered when the Messiah comes. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, hopefully with fewer interruptions in the live stream. At the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. I hope everybody had a meaningful fast today, the 10th of Teves, and that we managed to, maybe these interruptions were just a reminder, right? It's not in our hands. Everything's in God's hands. But that we should be mourning for the loss of the temple. And if we achieved some real sadness today, at the fact that we don't have the temple in our midst and we don't have that revealed, at least a place of God's presence revealed. If we mourn for that and we want and desire it badly, then may we merit to see it realized in our days, or at least it will return for it when it happens. Messiah comes, resurrection of the dead, etc., and the temple reestablished in our midst. May it come soon. We say Amen. Have a good night.